to Farm Here Daily, a Field Forward podcast. I'm your host, David Geiger. Today on Farm Here Daily, we're going to review the growing season, looking at the diseases that popped up and how they impacted the crop with ISU Extension plant pathologist Alison Robertson. Please be sure to like and follow the podcast as well as our social media at Field Forward Pod. We would love to have you join our community, keeping folks informed about what is affecting our farmers. This is Farm Here Daily. And joining me on Farm Here Daily, we're going to take a look at Iowa plant pathology with extension specialist, plant pathology specialist at ISU, Alison Robertson. Alison, thank you so much for joining me again on Farm Here Daily. It's been a few months since we last chatted, and we really extensively got into southern rust at that point. And I wanted to just start off by taking a look at the review of this summer, of this growing season with you, and some of the different pest pressures we've seen, diseases for these plants that you've seen. What are some of the top notes? I imagine southern rust is one of them. What is kind of your review of southern rust and some of the others?
So 2025 is definitely the year of southern rust. It may even be the century of southern rust, right? So we had historic levels of southern rust across Iowa, particularly in central Iowa. It's probably where we had the most severe southern rust. The other thing about this growing season is it was warmer than usual. It was wetter than usual. I think we had the second wettest July on record. So warmer than usual, wetter than usual. Southern rust got here early, kind of the middle of July, which is actually the same time it got here last year, right? But the warmer and the wetter meant that we just had perfect conditions for that southern rust to develop. And so, yes, historic levels of southern rust across the state. We also saw a little bit of tar spot. Tar spot, perhaps not as much as we expected to see, probably because we were warmer. And then, as I like to say, there just wasn't any real estate left on the corn leaf, right, for the tar spot. We also saw curvularia, that was the first report of curvularia in Iowa. That's a new, more tropical leaf spot that occurs. I think that we also saw a lot of crown rot and then stalk rot issues at the end of the season, definitely because we had that southern rust, right, that affected that photosynthesis. And so now the corn plant had to cannibalize itself to fill the grain. And then as I was out the last couple of weeks just finishing up my trials, I did see a fair amount of ear rot. I don't know that I'd be particularly concerned, but I would say that we need to just double check our fields, right, for things like fusarium ear rot. That's probably mostly what I saw because of the associated mycotoxins. So a lot of different things going on there. Definitely a great year for me as a plant pathologist. Probably not a great year for most other folks.
I had a couple questions cross my mind as you were speaking there. And the first one, I'm just going to go very crazy. So you mentioned that there wasn't a lot of real estate for other diseases when it came to southern rust being already there.
Yes.
Is that a case in which maybe some plants were a little bit protected because the southern rust was so late it didn't affect the actual crops and then it protected them from other diseases? Or is that just full on the southern rust was bad on its own and it just meant we didn't get other diseases because those would have been just as bad?
So, I mean, it's interesting that you bring that out, right? Because actually I found the curvularia on plants that had been sprayed with a fungicide. And so they were protected against the southern rust. And then we saw the curvularia come in. So that suggests to me that, first of all, the curvularia arrived later on in the growing season than the southern rust. And because I'd sprayed that fungicide, I'd protected that leaf against the southern rust. So now there was real estate for that curvularia to infect as that fungicide ran out. So I thought in most of my trials, when I found curvularia, it was where I had a particularly good fungicide that had kept that plant green for a good length of time. And I would say that that's maybe true with the northern corn leaf blight. Came on, well, we saw that a good way through the season, probably because we were so wet, but we did see it increase towards the end of the season. And I haven't looked at my data closely enough there, but possibly more northern corn leaf blight on those plants that were well protected against the southern rust. But having said that, those diseases also came in really late, right, after dent or during that dent stage. And so probably didn't have a lot of impact on yield like the southern rust would have, coming in so early during that grainful period.
Okay, that answered the question that I think I was kind of really getting to, which was what was the end result then? Did those fungicide applied plants yield better or worse than if someone, say, had just pushed through and been like, we'll just risk the southern rust damage?
So what I mean, I don't have any of my yields back from my trials, but what I've been hearing from the field is that people are seeing 20 to 70, 100 bushels where they use the fungicide. So
Wow.
yes. And I think that a lot of that is going to depend on the hybrid as well, right? So some hybrids were very, very susceptible to the southern rust. And then the other thing is some hybrids filled those kernels really well, whereas with other hybrids we seemed to the grain didn't fill as well. That grainful period was shortened, and when you go out there and you feel those ears, they feel like 6-year-old teeth, right? Those kernels are just wiggling around. They really didn't fill. So I was at a hybrid trial last week, or a hybrid demonstration, and I definitely saw big differences between hybrids. Some of them, those ears are huge. They filled out, the kernels are huge, and other ones that, I don't know, they just didn't finish grainful. So
Wow. On the other question that I thought of when you were speaking about a little bit earlier, you were talking about how we had the warm and wet conditions. And as far as I understand, warm and wet tend to be really good for diseases.
yes,
But in Iowa plants specifically, it's not good for all diseases. Some of the disease pressure likes cold and wet.
yes.
Did you see some of that interaction? So having a better impact on some of our crops there?
I mean, I think that if I'm going to answer your question correctly, I mean, I think that's what a good example would be tar spot, right? So tar spot was reported earlier in Iowa, I think, than it's ever been reported. Maybe that
Right.
first week
Yeah, the
of
spring.
June,
Yeah, yeah.
right? And and then it just southern rust just came in, right? And tar spot did nothing, right? One of the reasons why tar spot did nothing is because tar spot prefers those cooler conditions, right, that we have during the spring when we're planting, those 60, 70-degree days. Tar spot loves that. But once we get into this, 75 to 85, it's just too warm for tar spot. And so it'll just stop developing. And so I think that's a good example of how temperature will drive different diseases.
I want to talk a little bit about the soybean side because we've really focused on corn. Did we see some pretty difficult situations for soybean producers, or how did they fare as opposed to the corn crop?
So for soybean, it wasn't as interesting from a plant pathology perspective as with corn, but we did see a lot of sudden death syndrome. That was probably the biggest disease in soybeans, and really not unexpected because of those very wet conditions that we had during the growing season. I think for some growers learned that including that Alivo or Soltro in their seed treatment was a good idea. And for those growers who decided, because of the economy at the moment, right, maybe to save a few dollars on Soltro or Alivo, they got stung from not using those products, right? And so I know Darren was just saying, I've just come from another interview like this, where I was with Darren Mueller, and Darren was saying that there are some treatments on the seed that you could have probably left out of to cover the cost of that Saltro and Allevo. But if you know that you have a field with a history of SDS, it's always probably a good idea to include that Saltro or Allevo just to manage that in the unlikelihood or the likelihood that we have a wet growing season. So SDS was the main thing. And then Darren was also saying that he's been finding a lot of anthracnose in soybeans this year, which is probably related to the growing conditions that we had, warm and wet. But he's doing a lot of research in that area. So I'm sure we'll learn a lot over the next couple of years.
I have spoken to you many times over the years about some of the sudden death syndrome, and just as kind of a reminder, refresher for me and some of the folks out there, SDS is very soil dependent on that's where you really find where the disease is.
Yes.
And it can stay there for up to 10 years. Is that right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So once you have SDS in a field, you basically have the pathogen that causes that SDS. It's there forever. There was some research that was done that shows that pathogen can live as a saprophyte on dead tissue, including corn residue and corn seed. So even our rotation to corn is not going to help decrease the amount of inoculum.
This is Farm Your Daily. We will continue the conversation in just a moment, but we're going to take a quick look at the marketplace. And there was some green on the board at the Tuesday market close. December corn, 4.5 cents up, 4.26 and a quarter. March rising 4 1/4 at 4.43. Soybeans in November, a penny more at 10.12, with January a penny and a quarter up at 10.31 3/4. Soybean meal in October, $3.80 a ton in the red, $275.10. Soybean oil, a fifth of a penny higher, $49.35 a pound. December wheat, 9 3/4 more, 5.20 and a half, with March rising 9 1/2 at 5.39. Hard red winter wheat in December, 9 1/4 cents up at 5.11 and a half, with March an increase of 8 3/4 at 5.32 and a half. In the livestock market close for Tuesday, October live cattle down $1.55 a hundredweight, $235.60. December falling $1.47, $238.75. Feeder cattle in October, 77 cents a hundredweight more, $362.12, with November rising 85 cents at $360.75. Lean hogs in October, $1.72 up at $100.52, with December an increase of $1.97 at $90.72 a hundredweight. That is the Tuesday market close. This is Farm Your Daily. Alison, let's return back to your specialty of corn. And you mentioned about 5 different diseases that you were looking at this season. Did anything outside of southern rust really stand out to you as having an interesting year?
I think I've heard a lot of reports of crown rot, which probably more so than the last couple of years. And that could have been due to the very cool, wet conditions that a lot of people planted into. We were pretty cool. At the beginning of the growing season, we were actually, if we look at the growing degree day accumulation, we were at normal or just below normal. But then once we get into July, those very warm conditions, growing degree days, just right at the moment, we're like 10 to 14 days, ahead on our growing degree day accumulations. And so I don't know whether that had anything to do with that. We're still trying to get a handle on crown rot. The other thing would be standability, right? And that just relates back to the southern rust. So yeah, nothing. I guess I was kind of surprised to see all the northern corn leaf blight. Northern corn leaf blight likes rain, so that makes sense. But I thought it was pretty warm, and so I didn't expect to see as much northern corn leaf blight as I did see.
I guess as we move into harvest, something very important for the standability would be something like the stalk rot that you were speaking about as well. how have you seen that impact some of the standability and some of the early harvest maybe for some corn fields because of it?
I think there's no grower who wants to harvest pickup sticks, right? And so I think that between extension and the industry and ag business, that the word got out because of southern rust that standability could be horrible. I think also the fact that we're 10 to 14 days ahead in growing degree days. And so, I mean, I know a lot of people commented that the corn just died, right? And there were a lot of fingers pointed at southern rust. And I'm not sure that southern rust definitely had something to do with it, but we also had an extremely warm growing season, right? And that corn just matured earlier than it did last year. And so that's why we're out there harvesting earlier, than we did last year.
When you're looking at the standability, how much of the issue of standability was because of disease?
And I think, yeah, and I mean that's a great question because I was actually thinking about this the other day. I was talking with one of my students, right? Stalk rot is a disease when it occurs before physiological maturity, right? Because that plant, that's a disease. That plant is not able to perform as it should, right? But once we get to black layer development, once we get to physiological maturity, then stalk rot is just natural decay of the plant. That's what happens, right? And so, yeah, I mean, as I think about standability for this year, southern rust had something to do with it, but also this warmer season so that we matured earlier. And so when you're thinking about, okay, I'm going to get out there and harvest in the middle of September, and now all of a sudden, and then we also had some fields were planted very, very early, right? On top of that. So all of a sudden, we need to go out and harvest corn at the beginning of September. Or as we're driving around the state, we're seeing all these like dead cornfields. It was easy to point a finger at southern rust, but I think that there were a lot of early planting, a range of relative maturities out there, growing degree day accumulation, plus the southern rust. And then together, those all impact the stalk integrity and therefore the standability. So I've been like pondering this the last couple of days. Can you tell?
Yeah, and that's the interesting part of how the science and how agronomy works is there are so many different possibilities for how something can ultimately show what's going on. And so it's very difficult to dig into what is the actual reason for a variety of things because it could be one thing, it could be another, it could be a combination, and it all depends on which field you're looking at.
Yes, exactly. Yep. And I could throw in there as well whether a fungicide was sprayed or not, right? Because where the fungicide was sprayed, probably going to have better standability where, yeah. So
I guess as a kind of wild goose question that I was thinking about just this last week, it's more, it affects farmers, but it affects everybody as well. I was thinking with all the disease pressure this year, I feel like I got hit with some of the weirdest and worst allergies I've ever gotten in the last week. Are the spores of all these diseases or as harvest begins, that going into the air affecting a lot of us? Are you recommending things like masks for folks that are harvesting that? And can that affect humans just by being an allergen of some kind?
yes, absolutely. Right. I mean, those spores are flying everywhere, right? And yes, and so some people are going to have allergies to the different types of spores. So yes, I wouldn't be surprised if you just happen to suffer from those allergies this year, right? I find that some years I have allergies and other years I don't,
Right.
and
Yeah.
it's we just got different organisms floating around. I think that if you're particularly susceptible to allergies or if you have respiratory issues, that it's always a good idea to wear a mask, right? Just to prevent that gunk getting down into your lungs, which are nice and warm and moist, and a great environment for those spores to hang out in if they want to. And then your body just has to fight something else, right? So yeah.
All right. Well, that'll be my one wild question. I'll end it on this note then. As we are getting combines rolling out there, folks are really getting out there harvesting. What would be kind of the thing you're watching, aside from some of your yield results from your trials? What are the pressures you're looking at in fields right now, or are you looking at pressure right now?
I mean, yeah, a good question. I think I've mentioned the air rods, so, and then the standability. So go out, check your fields, figure out what fields have to be harvested first, right? Push those stalks, check that standability. And while you're out there pushing stalks, check the ears. Do you notice some ear molds? Could this be a concern for mycotoxins? I guess the other thing that I'm thinking about is also just feel those ears, right? Some of those ears we did not get very good grain fill in. They kind of feel like the teeth of a 6-year-old. They're kind of wiggly, right? And so that would indicate to me not good grain fill, probably lower test weight. And the thing with lower test weight corn is it really doesn't store well. So it would, maybe just thinking along the lines of where you're going to store this corn, how you're going to store this corn, when you're going to sell it, etc. So I think those are just some ideas from a plant pathologist.
Well, they are very appreciated. Plant pathologist, ISU Extension, Alison Robertson, thank you so much for your time today, joining me on Farm Here Daily.
Thanks for having me, David.
This is Farm Here Daily, a Field Forward podcast. Thank you for listening. Again, in order to continue to produce this type of local content, we would love to have you join our community. So please follow the podcast as well as our social media channels at Field Forward Pod. You can also find me on social media at Geiger Reports. Again, I am your host, David Geiger, and I'll be back again tomorrow, everybody.